The projector beam slanted through the dust motes hanging in the conference room air, casting rows of system architecture diagrams across the matte white wall. The air hummed with the low, steady whir of the ceiling-mounted projector fan, layered over the faint whoosh of the building's HVAC system pushing chilled air through the ceiling vents. It was 2:37 in the afternoon, the kind of gray, drizzly Seattle October day where the light never quite brightens past soft twilight, and the floor-to-ceiling windows along the east wall streaked with slow-moving raindrops that blurred the skyline of downtown Bellevue into a wash of muted glass and steel. 12 venture capital partners from VentureEdge Capital sat arrayed around the long mahogany boardroom table, leather-bound notebooks open in front of most of them, half-empty ceramic mugs of coffee sweating onto paper coasters. At the head of the table sat Felix Ward, the firm's managing partner, his silver hair combed back neat, his expression unreadable as he leaned forward slightly, eyes fixed on the screen. Next to him, 3 of his senior analysts scribbled quiet notes, their pens scratching softly against paper. On the opposite side of the table sat the full C-suite of Prism Systems Incorporated, Warren King, the CEO, flanked by his chief financial officer, his chief revenue officer, Sterling Howe, the head of HR, and Lynette Pierce, the newly installed chief operating officer. Their faces were half-shadowed in the dim, projector-lit room, and most of them looked bored. Elias Thorne stood at the podium, his throat dry from 40 minutes of uninterrupted presentation, and tapped the clicker once more to pull up the Prism Smart City OS Phase 2 roadmap. His dark wool suit jacket hung over the back of a spare chair beside the podium. He'd shed it 20 minutes in, when the stage lights and the pressure of the pitch had started to warm his color. Underneath, he wore a crisp navy button-down, the cuffs rolled neatly to his forearms, and on his left wrist sat the same beat-up stainless steel digital watch he'd worn for 6 years. An engineering team gift the day Prism 1.0 went fully live in Tacoma, cheap but reliable, its face scuffed along the bottom edge from a dozen late nights of leaning against desk edges while debugging. Everything should have been going perfectly. The deployment metrics checked out, every number vetted and revetted 3 times over. 27% reduction in peak traffic congestion across 7 partner cities, 18% drop in municipal energy waste from smart streetlight and building management integration, 99.98% uptime across 3 years of live operation, better than any competing platform on the market. The client pipeline was stronger than it had ever been, with 3 new state-level contracts waiting to be signed the second the $75 million Series D funding round closed. Phase 2 would expand the platform into emergency response coordination, public transit dynamic routing, and water system leak detection, opening up an entirely new revenue stream and pushing Prism from a niche traffic tool into a full-stack city operating system. He'd spent 3 weeks refining this deck, pulling 3 all-nighters to run the last of the scalability simulations on the new distributed edge computing framework. He'd walked through every slide with his senior engineering leads, poked holes in every projection, stress-tested every claim. He'd been confident, up until 10 seconds ago, when he'd caught the way Warren flicked his eyes toward Sterling and gave the tiniest, almost imperceptible nod. Eli knew that nod. He'd known Warren for 10 years, had built this company with him from the ground up in a 600-square-foot Capitol Hill studio apartment with a leaky window and a mini fridge full of energy drinks, and he could read every single one of the man's tells. The slight tilt of the chin when he was about to deliver bad news he didn't mean. The way his thumb rubbed the engraved edge of his custom fountain pen when he was nervous about getting caught. The faint, almost invisible tightness around his jaw when he was lying. This wasn't good news. It wasn't even neutral. "Elias," Warren said, leaning back in his padded leather chair and adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses with a slow, deliberate flick of his wrist. His tone was heavy with manufactured regret, the kind of voice people used when they were about to stab you in the back and wanted to pretend they hated doing it. Warren was 51, silver at the temples, with the soft, well-fed look of a man who'd traded late-night coding sessions for country club golf outings and expense account stakes years ago. His suit was custom-tailored, his shoes handcrafted Italian leather, the kind of thing he never would have been able to afford back when they were splitting a $5 frozen pizza for dinner every night. We've reviewed your proposal. The board's come to a decision about the future of this project. Eli's finger stilled on the clicker. He didn't say anything. He just waited. He already knew what was coming, somewhere in his gut. He'd seen the writing on the wall for months, ever since Lynette had shown up. He'd just been too stubborn, too loyal, too invested in the product to admit it out loud. Moving forward, Warren said, slow and soft, like he was delivering bad news to a grieving widow, Lynette will be taking over full oversight of the Prism rollout. All engineering teams will report directly to her office going forward. Phase 2 will be reframed as an operations-led initiative, with her at the helm. A quiet murmur rippled through the venture-edge side of the table. The analysts paused their note-taking, glancing at each other, confused. Felix's brow furrowed, just slightly. Eli's gaze flicked to the far end of the table, where Lynette Pierce sat picking at her diamond-chip gel manicure like there was nothing more interesting in the room. She was Warren's sister-in-law, 34 years old, with a business degree from a no-name online school and zero experience in enterprise software. 3 months prior, Warren had installed her as Chief Operating Officer over the entire operations division, ignoring every single member of the engineering leadership team who'd warned him it was a mistake. She'd walked in on day one with a designer tote bag full of process improvement, checklists, and immediately started rearranging teams, moving her own people into key roles and siphoning budget away from R&D into pet projects run by her friends. She hadn't spoken once during the entire presentation, had spent most of it scrolling through her phone under the table, typing quiet texts to someone. Now she looked up, her cherry-red lips curving into a faint, smug little smile, and wiggled her fingers at him in a mock wave. Like she was already celebrating. "Excuse me," Eli said. He kept his voice flat. No anger, no surprise. Just a quiet request for clarification, the same tone he used when a junior engineer turned in buggy code and tried to pass it off as finished. He didn't yell. He never yelled. Yelling was for people who didn't have facts on their side. "What he means," Sterling Howe cut in, the head of human resources sliding a thick manila envelope across the table toward him, the company logo embossed in glossy gold on the flap, "is that your employment with Prism Systems is terminated. Effective immediately." Sterling was the sort of man who'd never had an original thought in his life, who'd built his entire career on doing the dirty work of people more powerful than him and asking no questions. He wore a crisp charcoal suit, his hair gelled into a rigid side part, and his voice was crisp, rehearsed, like he'd read this script a dozen times in the mirror that morning. He didn't look Eli in the eye as he spoke. His gaze fixed on a spot just above Eli's left shoulder, like he was delivering a weather report instead of ending a 10-year career. "Our internal audit team uncovered 3 falsified expense reports in your Q3 submissions. The amounts are not large, just under $2,000 total, a couple of ride-sharing receipts, a meal reimbursement that didn't match the client calendar, but the violation is a matter of gross misconduct. Per company policy, Section 37, Subsection B, there is no severance package for termination with cause. You will receive pay for hours worked this pay period, and that is all. Company property stays here. Your laptop, your access badge, your key fob. Security will escort you out once you've collected your personal items from your desk." The room went dead quiet. Even the projector fans seemed to hum louder, suddenly, filling the silence. The venture edge analysts froze, pens hovering over paper. Felix sat up straight, his jaw tightening, and turned to look at Warren, his voice sharp with poorly concealed irritation. "Warren, a word. What is this? We're 40 minutes into a Series D final review and you're firing your CTO? You didn't think to mention this material personnel change before we flew up from San Francisco." "Felix, I understand this is unexpected," Warren said, sighing heavily, the sound heavy and put upon, like this was somehow harder for him than it was for Eli. "But compliance is non-negotiable. We can't have people fudging expenses, not with the auditors coming in next month, not right before a funding round. It sets a bad precedent." Lynette flagged the discrepancy during her operational review of the engineering department, and I can't play favorites. Not with the integrity of the company on the line. He gestured at the envelope like it was irrefutable proof, like it wasn't a stack of forged receipts they'd cooked up over the past 2 weeks. Eli didn't even bother opening the envelope. He knew exactly what was inside: forged ride-share receipts from trips he'd never taken, doctored meal reimbursement forms for dinners he'd never attended, a whole little pile of evidence tailored to look just plausible enough to justify a firing. Paper-thin if anyone actually dug into it, but good enough for a quick execution in a boardroom full of people who didn't want to ask too many questions. He'd known this play was coming the second Lynette had walked through the front door with her designer tote and her list of process improvements that all just happened to involve siphoning authority away from the engineering team. It had never been a question of if, only when. The writing had been on the wall 6 weeks prior, when Lynette had marched into his office unannounced and dropped a stack of vendor contracts on his desk, insisting that her cousin's web development firm be brought on to handle the Phase 2 front-end overhaul. Eli had looked at the firm's portfolio, amateurish, buggy, way overpriced, and said no. Flat out. No room for negotiation. The quality wasn't there, the price was 3 times market rate, and he wasn't going to sink Phase 2 just to line her family's pockets. Lynette had smiled that cold, tight smile of hers and picked the contracts back up. "You'll regret that," she'd said, quiet enough that only he could hear. And then she'd walked out. He'd known then she'd come for him. He just hadn't thought they'd do it now. 2 weeks before the funding round closed. 2 weeks before his year-end bonus hit his bank account, the bonus he'd been counting on to cover his mom's next 6 months of cancer treatment. He'd thought they'd have the decency to wait until the money was in the bank. Apparently even that was too much to ask. Apparently they thought he'd fold. That he'd slink out quietly, too humiliated to fight back. That he'd take it on the chin and move to another company and never say a word. They didn't know him very well. Warren sighed again, leaning forward slightly, putting on his best concerned friend face. "You're one of the originals, Eli. I wish it didn't have to be this way. Truly. But rules are rules. If it were up to me." "It is up to you," Eli said, quiet, calm. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The room was so quiet every word carried. "You're the CEO. You make the rules. You're just hiding behind compliance to do your dirty work." Warren's face tightened. He didn't like being called out on it. Not in front of the investors. Eli stared at him, and for a second, 10 years of history flashed through his head, fast as a film reel. 10 years of building this thing side by side, surviving on frozen pizza and gas station coffee, pulling all-nighters when the servers crashed and clients threatened to walk. He remembered the first office, that tiny walk-up with the server rack in the closet that hummed so loud they had to shout over it to have a conversation. The summer the AC broke, and they worked in front of 3 box fans for 2 weeks, their shirts soaked through with sweat. He remembered Warren showing up at his door at 2 a.m. with a half-eaten pepperoni pizza and a rambling dream about building a smart city system that would actually work. That wouldn't be the usual overpriced government vaporware that never delivered on half its promises. Back then, Warren couldn't even afford the $1,200 monthly server rental fee for their first beta deployment. Eli had drained his own savings account, $12,000 he'd put aside for a down payment on a condo, money he'd saved up through college and 2 years of contracting to cover the first 6 months of hosting. He'd written the first 10,000 lines of the Prism kernel himself, hunched over a beat-up 2015 ThinkPad on his kitchen table, working 18 hours a day for 6 months straight, skipping birthdays and holidays and every chance at a social life. He'd missed his little sister's college graduation because they were launching their first pilot in Tacoma and the system had crashed 4 hours before go live. He'd missed his mom's 60th birthday because a client had demanded an emergency feature update over Christmas week. He'd given this company everything. They'd grown from 2 guys in a walk-up to a 200-person company with municipal contracts across 3 states, a valuation hovering at $500 million. Somewhere along the way, Warren had traded in his hoodies for tailored suits, started spending more time at charity galas and golf tournaments than in the engineering bullpen, and surrounded himself with people like Lynette and Sterling. Yes men and family members who'd never written a line of code in their lives, but were very good at telling people who had how to do their jobs. He'd started believing his own press releases, started thinking he was the visionary genius behind everything, instead of the guy who schmoozed clients while Eli did the actual building. Build a kingdom with your own two hands, and eventually the king will decide you're too close to the throne. It was an old story, as old as business itself. Eli had just never thought he'd be the one starring in it. He didn't argue. He didn't yell. He didn't list every late night, every crisis he'd pulled them out of, every bug he'd fixed at 3 a.m. when the whole system was minutes away from crashing and Warren was at a black tie fundraiser. There was no point. The verdict was already in. The trial had been a show. Arguing would just make him look desperate, and he wasn't desperate. Not yet. He just closed his laptop, the familiar worn plastic of the casing smooth under his fingers. The keyboard keys faded in the spots he pressed most often after a decade of typing. He reached into his bag and pulled out the unmarked portable solid-state drive he always carried with him in a padded neoprene sleeve. It was small, black, no logos or stickers on the outside, and it contained every line of core Prism code he'd ever written, every version of the kernel dating back to the very first prototype, every backup, every iteration, every line of he'd ever left for himself. He'd kept a local, offline copy since day one. Old habit. Paranoia, some people called it. Preparation, he called it. You never knew when the floor might drop out from under you. 2 uniformed security guards hovered by the conference room door, stiff and awkward, like they hated being there but were getting paid too much to complain. They watched him like he was about to stuff a server tower under his coat and run for it. Like the most valuable thing this company owned was locked in the supply closet. Like they had any idea what the real crown jewel was or where it was kept. He slung his leather bag over his shoulder and headed for the door. "Wait, Eli," Lynette called out, her voice sweet and syrupy, like they were old friends catching up after years apart. He stopped and turned. She was smiling, bright and fake, twirling a strand of highlighted hair around her finger. "Make sure you send over all the handoff docs, okay? Especially the core kernel architecture notes and the optimization algorithm white papers. Nobody knows that stuff like you do. We'd be totally lost without them. Can't have the system falling apart now, right?" She laughed, light and breezy, like this was all just a friendly transition, like she hadn't just helped orchestrate his firing to steal his life's work. Like she actually thought he'd hand over every last secret and walk away quietly. Eli looked at her for a long, quiet second. Then he smiled. It was a thin, cool little smile, nothing warm about it, the kind of smile you give someone right before you watch their whole world fall apart. "You'll get your architecture notes," he said. And he walked out. The conference room door clicked shut softly behind him. The hallway outside was brighter, lit with cool white LED panels that buzzed faintly overhead, and the carpet was the same boring charcoal gray it had been since they'd moved into the office 3 years prior. He walked past the open engineering bullpen, and heads popped up over cubicle walls, eyes wide. Word traveled fast in an office this size. Everyone had already heard or guessed. A few of the senior engineers gave him small, sympathetic nods. A few looked away, awkward, like they were afraid to be seen making eye contact. Jesse Marlowe, his lead back-end engineer, opened his mouth like he was going to say something, then thought better of it and just gave him a sharp, quiet nod. Eli nodded back. Nobody said anything. Nobody wanted to get on Sterling's bad list. Nobody wanted to be next. He didn't blame them. Most of them had mortgages, student loans, families to feed. Standing up for him would just get them fired too, and it wouldn't change anything. He didn't hold it against them. The elevator ride down to the lobby was silent. He watched the floor numbers tick down, one by one, and stared at his reflection in the brushed steel doors. 34 years old, faint lines around his eyes from squinting at computer screens for too many hours a day, dark hair starting to thin just a little at the temples, a faint scar along his left eyebrow from a college biking accident. He looked tired. He was tired. But he didn't look defeated. The rain was coming down hard when he stepped through the building's front doors, cold October rain that soaked through his wool suit jacket in seconds and plastered his dark hair to his forehead. He didn't have an umbrella. He didn't bother pulling his coat hood up. He just stood there for a minute on the sidewalk in front of the glass tower he'd helped build and let the rain wash over his face. It was cold, sharp, bracing. It cleared his head. Cars hissed past on the wet street, their tires kicking up plumes of gray water. Commuters hurried past with umbrellas tucked low, their coats pulled tight around their collars. Nobody paid him any mind. Just another guy in a suit, standing in the rain, looking like he'd just had the worst day of his life. His phone buzzed in his pants pocket, sharp and insistent, vibrating against his thigh. He pulled it out, water beading on the Gorilla Glass screen. It was a notification from the hospital billing department, Swedish Medical Center, oncology ward. His mother's targeted lung cancer therapy payment had failed. Insufficient funds. Current account balance, $1,847.22. Next treatment scheduled in 3 days. The bottom dropped out of his stomach, just for a second. 10 years ago, he'd turned down a $220,000 offer from Google to join Warren's stupid little startup. 10 years later, he was unemployed, standing in the rain, and he couldn't even afford his mom's medication. Warren had known about the cancer, too. Knew how badly Eli needed the $40,000 year-end bonus he'd been counting on to cover the next 6 months of treatment. Knew his mom was in the middle of a critical phase of her therapy, that missing a dose could be fatal. He'd chosen this timing on purpose. Knew Eli would be at his most vulnerable. Thought he'd fold, beg for his job, take whatever scraps they threw him. Thought he'd do anything to keep the insurance and the bonus. Rain dripped off his chin onto the phone screen, smudging the numbers. Eli wiped it off with the sleeve of his soaked jacket, his hands steady. No anger. No self-pity. Just cold, clear focus, the same focus he used when debugging a critical production issue at 2 a.m. He didn't have time to feel sorry for himself. He had a problem to solve. He'd spent 10 years building Prism. He'd also spent 10 years making sure he could never be erased from it. He stepped under the awning of a corner convenience store to get out of the rain, the little bell above the door jingling as someone walked out. He leaned against the brick wall, sheltered from the worst of the downpour, and scrolled through his contacts until he found the name he was looking for, Felix Ward, Venture Edge Capital. Lead investor on the current funding round. The man who'd agreed to pump $75 million into Prism Systems largely on the strength of its proprietary, one-of-a-kind technology Eli had built from scratch, line by line, in his kitchen. Felix was a sharp guy. He didn't suffer fools, and he hated being lied to. He also hated losing money. If there was one thing Eli knew about venture capitalists, it was that they cared about one thing above all else, protecting their downside. And right now, Warren was about to hand them all a world of downside. He pressed call. It rang twice. Elias? Felix's voice was warm, curious, the voice of a man who was used to getting good news on phone calls. He was in his late 40s, silver-haired, sharp-eyed, with a reputation for backing underdog founders and cutting his losses fast when things went south. To what do I owe the pleasure? I was just going over your Phase 2 deck this morning. That traffic optimization module is impressive work. Game-changing, honestly. We're excited to get this round closed. Felix, Eli said, his voice even, no trace of the rain or the firing in it. I think there's something you need to know about Prism Systems. Something material to your investment. Something you haven't been told. There was a beat of silence on the other end. Felix was a sharp guy. He'd picked up on the tone immediately. No small talk, no pleasantries. This was bad. What's going on? I was fired 10 minutes ago, Eli said. Gross misconduct, falsified expenses. Complete fabrication. A setup. But that's not the important part. Then what is? Felix's voice was sharp now, all casual warmth gone. The core Prism kernel. The underlying architecture, the core optimization algorithms, the source code for the entire smart city platform. Eli paused, watching the rain sheet down across the street, cars hissing through the deep puddles, their headlights blurred into long streaks of white and red. I own it. Exclusively. The company only has a license. A license that terminates the second my employment ends. Silence. Dead silence for a full 3 seconds. Eli could almost hear the gears turning in Felix's head, the math being done, the implications landing. "Meet me in an hour," Felix said. His voice was sharp now, all casual warmth gone, pure unadulterated business. "The private tatami room at Kodo's Sushi, downtown. Don't be late. Bring proof. All of it." Eli hung up. He pushed off the brick wall and walked into the convenience store, the bell above the door jingling softly. The air inside was warm, thick with the smell of hot dogs rotating on the roller grill and freshly brewed coffee. He bought a cup of black coffee from the machine by the counter, the paper cup warm against his cold fingers. It was bitter, burnt-tasting, but hot. He leaned against the linoleum counter and sipped it, watching the rain fall, and thought about the contract he'd signed 10 years ago. Warren had laughed about it back then. Called it Eli's paranoid little safety net. They'd been sitting on the floor of that tiny Capitol Hill apartment, eating cold leftover pepperoni pizza out of the box, the ink still wet on the articles of incorporation. The place smelled like old carpet and server exhaust and cheap beer. Eli had slid the 3-page technical licensing agreement across the cardboard box they were using as a table, and Warren had flipped through it without reading most of it, sauce on his chin, grinning like this was all a silly formality. "Dude, really?" he'd said, taking a bite of pizza. "You don't trust me or something? We're partners here." "It's not about trust," Eli had said, tapping the signature line with his pen. He'd been 24, fresh out of his master's program, but he'd already seen enough startup horror stories to know better. His grad school advisor, Dr. Hale, had warned him specifically about it. Founders get pushed out all the time. The tech is your leverage. Never give it all away. He'd told Warren the truth back then. "The core kernel is my life's work. I built the first prototype before we even started this company, before I even met you, for my thesis project. The company licenses it from me. Non-exclusive, revocable, tied to my active employment in a senior technical role. If I leave for any reason, fired, quit, hit by a bus, the license terminates automatically, no notice required. You pay me a nominal annual licensing fee, $10,000 a year, and everyone's happy." Warren had shrugged and signed it without a second thought. He'd been desperate to get Eli on board, desperate to have a working product to pitch to investors. He'd never thought it would matter. 10 years of steady growth, 10 years of Eli never making waves, never asking for more equity, never pushing back on his decisions, and everyone had forgotten the agreement existed. The annual $10,000 fee had become just another line item in the budget, something accounts payable cut every year without question. Nobody had read the fine print in a decade. Nobody but Eli. He'd put it there for a reason. He'd seen what happened to technical founders at startups, what happened to the people who built the thing when the money guys and the politicians showed up. He'd always known there was a chance Warren would turn on him someday. He'd just hoped it wouldn't come to this. Hope was for people who couldn't afford backup plans. He finished his coffee, crumpled the cup up, and tossed it in the trash can by the door. Then he pulled his bag tighter over his shoulder and headed out into the rain again, walking toward the light rail station. He had 40 minutes to get downtown. He'd be early. He always was. 40 minutes later, he walked into the private tatami room at Kodo's Sushi, his coat still damp at the cuffs, his shoes left by the door in the traditional wooden rack. The room was quiet, insulated from the hum of the main dining room, lit by soft paper lanterns hanging from the ceiling. Felix was already there, a glass of cold sake in front of him, his face grave. He didn't waste time on small talk. He gestured for Eli to sit and pushed a plate of edamame across the low wooden table. Eli sat, cross-legged on the tatami mat, and pulled a small black USB drive out of the padded pocket of his bag, along with a thin printed folder. He slid both across the table to Felix. "On here is a full copy of the original 2016 technical licensing agreement, signed by me as licensor, by Warren as CEO of Prism Systems, and by your firm's seed round representative as a formal board observer." His voice was steady, even, no trace of anger or bitterness. "Just facts. Clause 4.2. The Prism core kernel, including all underlying system architecture, proprietary traffic and energy optimization algorithms, and original base source code, remains the exclusive intellectual property of Elias Thorne. Prism Systems Incorporated is granted a limited, non-transferable, non-exclusive license to use, modify, and distribute the kernel as part of its commercial offerings, contingent on the continuous active employment of Elias Thorne in a senior technical leadership role at the company. He paused, letting that land. Clause 4.3. Termination of employment, for any reason, including but not limited to termination for cause, voluntary resignation, layoff, or incapacitation, results in immediate, automatic, irreversible termination of the license. No prior notice required. The company has 72 hours to cease all commercial use, distribution, and modification of the licensed technology upon termination. Failure to do so constitutes copyright infringement, subject to statutory damages, injunctive relief, and recovery of all legal fees. Felix's jaw tightened. He picked up the drive and turned it over in his fingers, like it was a live grenade with the pin already pulled. He flipped open the printed folder, pulled out the agreement, and started reading. He read slowly, carefully, every line, his brow furrowing deeper and deeper with every page. The room was quiet. Outside, rain pattered softly against the paper window screens. Somewhere in the restaurant, a chef called out an order in Japanese. When Felix finished reading, he set the papers down carefully on the table, like they might shatter. "Are you telling me," he said, slow and deliberate, each word measured, "that the core revenue-generating asset of a $500 million company isn't actually owned by the company?" "Precisely." Eli poured himself a cup of hot jasmine green tea from the ceramic pot on the table. The steam curled up into his face, warm and fragrant. 10 years ago, when Warren was begging me to pass on Google and join him for pennies on the dollar, he agreed to those terms. It was the only way I'd take the risk. For 10 years, the company paid the annual license fee. It was small enough nobody noticed. Nobody asked questions. Nobody ever bothered to renegotiate. Everyone just forgot. He paused, took a slow sip of tea. It was good quality, smooth, no bitterness. Today, when they terminated my employment, the license terminated with it. Automatically. No notice required. As of 9:30 this morning, Prism Systems is operating its flagship product, the product that makes up 82% of its annual revenue, without any legal right to the underlying code. That's copyright infringement on a massive scale. Every client contract, every government deployment, every revenue stream tied to Prism, all of it is built on unlicensed IP now. If I wanted to, I could walk into federal court tomorrow morning and get an injunction shutting every single deployment down by the end of the week. Felix's face had gone very still. He knew exactly what this meant. Venture Edge was 72 hours away from closing a $75 million Series D at a $500 million valuation. If the core IP was tainted, that valuation was a fantasy. The whole investment was a house of cards built on sand. They'd lose every penny. Worse, every limited partner in the fund would come after them for due diligence malpractice. His reputation would take a hit he might never recover from. And Warren had lied to him. Straight to his face, not an hour prior, swearing everything was fine, that Eli had left for personal reasons, that the IP was all clean and in-house. Felix hated being lied to, almost as much as he hated losing money. Did Warren know this was coming? He asked. I think he forgot the clause existed. Eli's mouth twisted into a faint, bitter smile. 10 years is a long time. People forget the fine print when everything's going well, when they're winning awards and posing for magazine covers and playing CEO. But I didn't forget. This morning, an hour before the meeting, my lawyer sent formal certified notice to Prism's legal department. They have 72 hours to cease all use, distribution, and modification of the Prism kernel in all commercial products. If they don't, I file for federal copyright infringement, seek an immediate permanent injunction, and freeze every single deployment they have running in every city across the country. Felix leaned back against the padded wall, staring at the USB drive on the table. For a long time, he said nothing. He was doing the math, running the numbers, weighing his options in his head. He was a businessman, first and last. Emotions didn't factor into it. Only risk and reward. Option 1. Side with Warren. Fight the license in court. Try to invalidate the agreement. But that would take years, and in the meantime, the company would bleed out. Clients would leave. Top engineering talent would leave for competitors. The valuation would crater to nothing. They'd lose every dime they'd already put in, and the new round would be dead in the water. Option 2. Side with Eli. Cut Warren loose. Back the guy who actually owned the only asset that mattered. Restructure the company, clean house. Put the people who actually knew how to build the product in charge. The IP would be clean. The product would keep improving. The valuation would hold, and probably grow, now that the dead weight was gone. It wasn't really a choice. "You're going to burn the whole company to the ground," he said, finally. It wasn't an accusation. Just a statement of fact. "They tried to burn me first." Eli's voice didn't waver. "I didn't come here to gloat, Felix. I didn't call you to rub it in. I came here with an alternative. A way for you to protect your investment. For both of us to come out ahead of this mess." Felix's eyes sharpened. He leaned forward again, elbows on the table. "I'm listening. Right now, Prism Systems is worth $500 million on paper. Without the Prism kernel, without the core IP, it's worth maybe $5 million. A brand name, a bunch of office furniture, a bunch of client contracts that are about to be null and void the second I get an injunction. You'll lose almost everything. Your limited partners will scream. The fund's track record takes a massive hit." Eli leaned forward, his elbows on the table, his gaze steady. He wasn't negotiating from anger. He was negotiating from leverage, and they both knew it. "Here's the offer. You and I partner up. We form a new parent holding company, Prism Technologies Group. I contribute the full, unrestricted Prism kernel IP, plus $20 million in cash I've got saved up from bonuses and investments over the years. You contribute the full Series D funding allocation, $75 million, reallocated to the new entity. We use that combined capital to acquire all of Prism Systems' assets, client contracts, and personnel in a structured buyout. I end up with 51.9% of the combined entity. Full controlling interest. Final say on all technical and operational decisions. You keep your existing stake, same percentage as before, but now the IP is clean, the company is run by the person who built the product, and your investment is actually worth something long-term." He paused, letting the numbers land, giving Felix time to process. Warren gets diluted down to a 5% minority stake. No board seat. No operational control. No day-to-day involvement of any kind. He walks away with something, which is a hell of a lot more than he'll get if I sue the company into oblivion. We keep all the rank-and-file employees, keep all the client contracts, keep the business running without interruption. The only people who lose are the ones who caused this mess in the first place. Warren, Lynette, Sterling. Everyone else wins. Well, almost everyone. Felix stared at him for a long, assessing minute. He was weighing the risk, the reward, the cold hard math of it all. He'd known for a while that Warren was losing his grip. The nepotism had gotten out of hand over the past year, more and more unqualified family members popping up in leadership roles, more and more budget siphoned off into vanity projects that went nowhere. The engineering team was miserable. Turnover was up. Product velocity was down. Felix had been thinking about pushing for a CEO change for months, but he'd been waiting for the right moment. This wasn't exactly the moment he'd planned for, but it worked. "Warren called me an hour ago," Felix said, suddenly, a dry little laugh escaping him. "Swore up and down everything was fine, that you'd left for personal reasons, no disruption to the roadmap, IP all clean and in-house. Lied straight to my face. Didn't even flinch. I knew he was getting sloppy, but this?" He shook his head. He picked up the USB drive and slipped it into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket. "Your proposal has merit," he said. "I'll run it by my legal and finance teams first thing tomorrow, but I don't expect any pushback. For what it's worth. I think you're right. This company was always going to sink with Warren at the helm. He lost the plot somewhere around the Series B, got more interested in looking like a CEO than being one. More interested in impressing his country club friends than building a good product. He held out his hand across the table. Let's build something better. Eli shook it. His hand was steady. No triumph, no relief. Just quiet resolve. They spent the next 2.5 hours hammering out the details. They talked about debt structure, how to handle the company's outstanding loans, how to structure the acquisition so it didn't trigger massive tax penalties. They talked about personnel, which executives to keep, which to let go, how to retain the top engineering talent with retention bonuses and equity grants. They talked about client communication, a carefully timed press release, personal calls from Eli to every major client to reassure them the product roadmap was on track and the IP was fully secured. They talked about governance, a new board of directors, 3 seats, 2 from Venture Edge, 1 from Eli, no seat for Warren. By the time they were done, the sun had set, and the restaurant was starting to fill up with the dinner rush. Eli declined Felix's offer of dinner, said he had work to do. He had a lawyer to call, documentation to pull together, a plan to finalize. He walked back out into the rain, which had slowed to a light drizzle, and stood on the sidewalk for a minute, breathing in the cool, wet Seattle air. The city lights blurred into soft circles through the mist, red and white and gold. It felt like the end of something. It also felt like the beginning. He didn't go home right away. He took the light rail up to Capitol Hill, to the old neighborhood where they'd had their first office. He walked past the building, now a fancy co-working space, and stood on the sidewalk for a minute, staring up at the 3rd-floor window where they'd worked for 3 years. A lot of late nights behind that window. A lot of dreams. A lot of mistakes. Then he walked to the 24-hour diner down the street, the same one they'd used to go to after all-nighters, and sat in a booth by the window. He ordered a plate of pancakes and a cup of coffee, and sat there for a long time, watching the rain fall. He didn't feel like celebrating. He didn't feel vindicated. He just felt tired. And focused. This was only the beginning. The next 7 days were absolute chaos for Prism Systems. Day 1, the formal legal notice arrived at the front desk, certified mail, signature required. The receptionist signed for it and sent it up to the legal department, where a paralegal opened it, read it, and immediately panicked, running straight into the general counsel's office. Warren laughed it off at first. When his GC, Helen, came into his office to tell him about it, he waved a hand dismissively and told her it was a hollow threat. That Eli was just bitter and lashing out, that he'd never actually go through with the lawsuit. That they'd crush him in court if he tried. Sterling agreed, nodding along, saying Eli was all talk, that he was too soft to actually burn the company down. He's a nice guy, Sterling said, snorting. Nice guys don't sue. He'll calm down in a week, take a new job somewhere, and forget all about this. Sterling called Eli 10 minutes later, yelling into the phone about extortion and defamation, and how they'd blacklist him from every tech company on the West Coast, how he'd never work in this town again. Eli listened for exactly 10 seconds, then hung up and blocked his number. He didn't have time for posturing. He had an acquisition to structure. Day 2, Prism's in-house legal team dug the original 2016 contract out of the back of a rusted filing cabinet in the basement records room, covered in dust, buried under a decade of old employee handbooks and expired insurance policies. A first-year legal assistant had spent 3 hours down there, sneezing her way through boxes of old paperwork, before she'd found it in a manila folder labeled Old Tech Agreements, Do Not Discard, in the very back of the bottom drawer. Helen, the general counsel, read it once, read it twice, then read it a 3rd time, her stomach sinking lower with every page. She'd been at the company for 7 years, and she'd never seen this agreement before. Nobody had ever mentioned it. It was like it had been erased from corporate memory. She walked straight into Warren's corner office and closed the door behind her. When she left an hour later, she looked like she'd seen a ghost. Warren didn't come out of his office for the rest of the day. Someone from the admin team saw him through the frosted glass, pacing back and forth, yelling into his phone, knocking a coffee mug off his desk so it shattered on the carpet. The administrative assistant brought him a new mug an hour later, and he'd snapped at her for knocking too loud. The words started to leak out, slow at first, then faster. Something was very wrong. Day 3, Lynette called Eli. Her voice was shaky, tearful, nothing like the smug, sharp-edged woman from the conference room. She babbled about misunderstandings, about miscommunication, about how she'd never wanted any of this. It had all been Warren's idea. She'd just been following orders. Could they just sit down and talk it out, work something out, name his price, whatever he wanted? She'd make sure he got his bonus, his job back, whatever he needed. Eli said nothing, waited until she ran out of words, then hung up and blocked her number too. He didn't negotiate with people who'd tried to ruin his life to score a promotion. Especially not people who tried to blame all their choices on someone else the second things got hard. Lynette called back 3 more times from different numbers. He blocked every single one. By the end of the day, she'd stopped trying. That afternoon, the finance team started getting nervous. The CFO, Mark, pulled Warren aside and warned him that cash flow was tighter than they'd thought, that if the funding round didn't close soon, they'd have trouble making payroll at the end of the month. Warren told him to stop worrying, that the round was on track, that everything was fine. His voice was too loud, too sharp. Mark didn't believe him. He updated his LinkedIn profile that night. Day 4, the clients started panicking. Word had leaked, somehow, probably from the legal team, probably from someone who'd started updating their LinkedIn profile and told a friend at a client company. 3 separate municipal contracts called to demand formal, written confirmation of full IP ownership. The largest one, the City of Portland's Smart Traffic Management System, a $12 million annual contract, threatened to terminate their agreement if there was any risk of service disruption or legal action. The sales team started fielding calls nonstop. Nobody had any answers. Nobody knew what to say. They'd been told not to talk about it, told everything was fine, but nobody believed it. The sales director called Warren 3 times that day, begging for a statement he could give clients. Warren never called him back. In the engineering bullpen, morale tanked. People started gathering in the break room in small groups, whispering, speculating. Some said the company was about to go under. Some said Eli had left and taken all the code with him. Some said there was going to be a massive layoff. A few of the senior engineers started sending out resumes to other companies. Jesse Marlowe got 3 recruiter emails before lunch and replied to all of them. Nobody blamed him. Day 5, Venture Edge issued a formal press release announcing that the Series D funding round was on hold indefinitely, pending full, independent IP due diligence. The same afternoon, the company's primary commercial lender called in their $20 million revolving line of credit, citing a material adverse change clause in the loan agreement. The cash flow crunch was immediate and brutal. Mark, the CFO, ran the numbers 3 times, then went into Warren's office with the spreadsheets and told him straight, if the funding didn't come through in the next 2 weeks, they couldn't make payroll. They'd have to do mass layoffs, at least 30% of the company, maybe more. And if the IP lawsuit actually happened, they'd be bankrupt by the end of the quarter. Warren yelled at him for 20 minutes, called him a pessimist, told him he was overreacting. Mark just stood there and took it, then walked out and updated his resume too. Panic rippled through the office. People started updating their LinkedIn profiles at their desks, sneaking out for job interviews on long lunch breaks, whispering in the break room about who was going to get cut first. The kitchen stopped stocking the good coffee. The weekly team lunch was canceled for budget reasons. People started taking home their monitors and their personal desk plants, just in case they showed up one morning and the doors were locked. Day 6. Warren texted Eli at 7:30 in the morning. Just one line, "Can we talk? Name your place. I'll be there." Eli texted him back half an hour later, ground floor coffee shop, same building. 9 a.m. They met at the coffee shop on the ground floor of the Prism office building, the same one Eli had bought coffee from every morning for 10 years. The barista knew his order by heart, black drip coffee, no room for cream. Warren was already there when Eli walked in, sitting in the back booth by the window. He looked like he'd aged 10 years in a week. His hair was messy, uncombed, the salt and pepper strands sticking up in tufts. There were deep dark circles under his bloodshot eyes, and his tailored suit was wrinkled, like he'd slept in it. He had a half-empty oat milk latte in front of him that he hadn't touched, the foam already dissolved into a flat brown skin on top. He looked up when Eli slid into the booth across from him. For a second, he looked almost ashamed. Then he stiffened his jaw, and the look was gone. "Eli," he said, his voice rough, hoarse, like he'd been smoking a pack a day all week. "What do you want? Name your price. How much money do you want to drop this and re-sign the license? Whatever you want, I'll make it happen. Name a number. 200,000. 500. A million. Just tell me what you want." Eli stirred his black coffee slowly, the stainless steel spoon clinking against the ceramic. He was in no hurry. He'd already won. He just needed Warren to admit it. "I don't want your money, Warren." Warren blinked, confused, like it was the last answer he'd expected. "Then what do you want? Equity? Name your percentage. 20%. 30. CTO title, whatever you want. We can put you back in charge of engineering. Fire Lynette. Whatever. I want the company." Warren stared at him. Then his face twisted, red with anger, his hands balling into fists on the table, so tight his knuckles went white. "You're out of your goddamn mind. This is my company. I founded it. I built it. You were just the guy who wrote the code. You built the pitch decks. You schmoozed the investors. I built the product." Eli's voice was calm, unshakable, the voice he used when explaining a technical concept to a non-technical client. Slow, clear, impossible to argue with. "Without the code? You've got nothing. An empty office, a bunch of angry clients, and a mountain of debt. You know it. I know it. Everyone who's been in that office this week knows it. The bank knows it. The investors know it. The only person still pretending otherwise is you." He slid a thick-bound term sheet across the table, the pages crisp and newly printed, VentureEdge letterhead at the top. "Here's the deal. VentureEdge and I are forming a new parent company, Prism Technologies Group. We're acquiring all of Prism Systems' assets, client contracts, and personnel in a structured all-stock buyout. I contribute the full, unrestricted Prism IP, plus cash. I take 51.9% controlling interest. Final say on everything. You get a 5% minority stake, no board seat, no operational control, no day-to-day involvement of any kind. You get to keep a piece of the upside. You walk away with your reputation mostly intact. You don't have to declare personal bankruptcy. You don't have to explain to your wife and your daughter why you lost the house in Bellevue, the lake cabin, the private school tuition. All of it." He paused, leaning forward slightly, his voice level, no heat in it. "Just facts. Or you can say no. Tomorrow morning, I file for a preliminary injunction in federal court. I get the judge to shut down every Prism deployment in the country. Your clients sue for breach of contract, tens of millions in damages. VentureEdge pulls the funding and sues you for fraudulent misrepresentation. The bank calls your loan. You lose everything. You spend the next 5 years in court, fighting lawsuits you can't win. You end up working a middle management job at some enterprise software company just to pay the bills. Your call." Warren's hands were shaking. He stared at the term sheet, his jaw working like he wanted to yell, wanted to throw the table, wanted to call Eli every name in the book. But he couldn't. Because he knew Eli was right. He had no leverage. No cards left to play. He'd gambled, and he'd lost. And he'd lost because he'd gotten greedy, because he'd thought he could erase the man who'd built his entire product for him with a fake expense report and a rigged meeting. He'd thought Eli was soft. Thought he'd roll over. He'd been wrong. "You said we'd do this together," Warren said, quiet, defeated, like he was talking more to himself than to Eli. 10 years ago, in that apartment. You said we'd build something big. Something that mattered. You decided we weren't partners anymore when you put your sister-in-law in charge of my product and tried to throw me out with a fake expense report 2 weeks before my mom's next cancer treatment. Eli stood up, dropping a $5 bill on the table to cover his coffee. "Sign it by end of day tomorrow. Or don't. Either way, I move forward." He walked away without looking back. The next afternoon, Warren signed. The shareholder meeting was held the following Monday, in the same big corner conference room where Eli had been fired barely a week prior. He walked in wearing a tailored black wool coat, his leather laptop bag slung over his shoulder, and every head in the room turned at once. Warren sat in the back row, hunched in his chair, his face gray, defeated. Lynette wasn't there. Sterling Howe stood by the wall, trying to catch Eli's eye, forcing a nervous, obsequious smile that looked more like a grimace. The rest of the executive team sat silent, tense, waiting to see what would happen, waiting to find out if they still had jobs. Eli walked to the front of the room, set his bag down on the podium, and turned to face them. The projector was off. The lights were all the way up. He didn't need slides. "Good morning, everyone," he said, his voice clear and steady, carrying across the quiet room without a microphone. As most of you have already heard through the grapevine, Prism Systems is entering a new phase of operations. Effective immediately, following a formal asset acquisition, I am the new chairman and chief executive officer of this company. Felix Ward from VentureEdge will be joining the board as vice chair. Warren King will be stepping down from all operational and board roles, retaining a minority equity stake only. A low murmur rippled through the room. Relief, surprise, quiet excitement from the engineering teams, apprehension from the old guard executives who'd gotten their jobs by being loyal to Warren. "For the vast majority of you," he continued, "nothing changes. Your jobs are secure. Your salaries stay the same. Your teams stay intact. In fact, by the end of the quarter, we'll be rolling out a new company-wide equity incentive plan. Every individual contributor, every engineer, every support staff member who's here building the product will get a piece of it. We're going to get back to what matters, building the best smart city platform in the industry. No more office politics. No more unqualified family members getting leadership jobs they didn't earn. No more cutting corners on product quality to hit arbitrary quarterly targets. No more scapegoating people to cover for someone else's mistakes." There was a collective, quiet exhale around the table. People's shoulders relaxed. A few of the junior engineers exchanged small, relieved smiles. Jesse Marlowe, sitting in the back row, gave Eli a tiny, sharp nod. But, Eli said, sharp and clear, and the room went dead silent again, "Some people will be leaving. Effective immediately. For cause." His gaze settled on Sterling Howe, who went pale as a sheet, his face draining of color so fast it looked like he might faint. He took a half-step backward, like he was about to run for the door. "Mr. Howe, as head of human resources, you knowingly participated in the fabrication of evidence to terminate a senior employee for personal and political reasons. You helped coordinate a scheme to unjustly dismiss a founding employee to advance the personal agendas of members of the executive team. Your actions caused severe, material damage to this company, to its reputation, and to its financial position. You are terminated, effective immediately, for gross misconduct. No severance. No outplacement services. In addition, we will be conducting a full audit of all HR decisions made during your tenure, and we will be notifying every major HR industry association and every enterprise tech company in the Pacific Northwest of your conduct. You can collect your personal items from your desk. Security will escort you out." Sterling stared at him, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. He looked like he was about to beg, then thought better of it. He picked up his leather briefcase. He'd already packed it. Eli noticed, like he'd known it was coming, like he'd had his bag by the door all week just in case, and stumbled out of the room without a word. The heavy wooden door clicked shut softly behind him. Nobody said a word. Nobody looked surprised. Lynette's office was already empty. Her designer tote and her fancy desk plants and her framed diploma had been packed up and left in the hallway the day before. The night cleaning staff had told someone from the admin team they'd heard her crying in there for an hour, then left and never came back. Nobody had bothered to call her. Nobody missed her. The operations team had already started quietly undoing most of her process improvements. The meeting ended 20 minutes later after Eli walked through the Phase 2 roadmap and answered a handful of questions from department heads. People filed out, talking in low voices, a palpable sense of relief in the air. Jesse hung back for a second, clapping him on the shoulder. "Took you long enough," he said, grinning. "Everyone in engineering's been losing their minds with Lynette breathing down our necks. This place is gonna be 100 times better now. When do we get back to actually building stuff instead of filling out status reports?" "First thing tomorrow," Eli said, but he was smiling a little too. "Tell the team we're kicking off Phase 2 Edge Node design workshops this week. No more red tape. No more approval layers. We build what we think is right." Jesse nodded and headed out, already pulling out his phone to text the team. Eli walked down the hall to the corner office. The one that used to be Warren's. It was big, floor-to-ceiling windows along 2 walls, looking out over the downtown skyline and the Puget Sound glinting silver in the distance. The rain had stopped. Sunlight was breaking through the heavy gray clouds, slanting golden across the dark wool carpet. The office still smelled like Warren's expensive cologne and cigar smoke, faint but noticeable. He'd have to open the windows later, air the place out. He set his bag down on the big oak desk, pulled his portable SSD out of his pocket, and set it down next to the keyboard. That little drive had 10 years of his life on it. 10 years of late nights, of bug fixes at 3 a.m., of ideas scribbled on bar napkins and coded into reality. 10 years of work he'd almost lost because he'd trusted the wrong person. He sat down in the leather executive chair. It was softer than his old ergonomic chair from the engineering bullpen. More expensive. He didn't lean back. He just sat there for a minute, looking out at the city, at the streets where the Prism system managed every single traffic light, every single parking meter, every single street light. At the city he'd helped build, one line of code at a time. His phone lit up on the desk. A text message notification from the hospital oncology department. "Mr. Thorne, your mother's patient account has been credited in full. All outstanding balances are paid and prepayment has been applied for the next 6 months of targeted therapy. Please let our care team know if you have any questions or need to reschedule her appointment this week." Eli flipped the phone face down on the desk. He didn't need to reply. He'd call his mom later, after he'd settled in. Tell her everything was fine, not to worry about the bills. She'd ask if he was working too hard, and he'd tell her no, same as always. He opened his laptop, pulled up the Phase 2 architecture roadmap, and started making notes, typing fast, his fingers flying over the familiar keys. There was a lesson here, he supposed. The most dangerous thing you can do to a man isn't push him to the edge. It's push him to the edge and leave him time to plan his way back. This wasn't the end of it. There were competitors out there, bigger ones, multinational tech conglomerates waiting for a chance to eat Prism alive. There were more battles ahead. Harder ones. Clients to win. Products to build. Problems to solve. But this time, he was in control. Nobody was ever going to take his work from him again. Nobody. Outside, the sun climbed higher, breaking through the last of the clouds, and the city glowed. On the desk, the little black SSD sat quiet and unassuming, holding the foundation of everything. And Eli typed on, line by line, building the next version of the thing he'd started 10 years ago, in a tiny apartment, with a dream and a beat-up laptop and nothing to lose. Only this time, he wasn't building it for anyone but himself.